Welcome to Jackie's Craft Table. Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm finally publishing my 10 Cards 1 kit for Simon Says Stamps August card kit of 2018. It's called Mandy's Flowers. I just returned from vacation and this kit was sitting on my desk and I was so excited to start playing with it. Let's take a quick look at what's inside. That was a pack of Doodlebug's Tiny Heart Sprinkles. It also includes 12 single-sided sheets of pattern paper from Bo Bunny, and it's called Early Bird. Each one is so pretty, and I love the color scheme. They're very old-fashioned looking, and I really like that. They do have a good weight to them. I think this one with the fancy script is my favorite. But I do end up using a lot of the pattern paper for these 10 cards. I generally don't use a lot of pattern papers to make cards. I have a hard time deciding which ones to use, but I like these kits because it kind of forces you to use what is included. And that's the last of the pattern papers. This is a little bottle of Nouveau drops. It's called Bubblegum Blush. It's such a cute little bottle. I have the larger bottle of this, but I'm sure I'll use it up. It's one of my favorite colors. It was a cute little lollipop. Here's a yard of May Arts Natural Twine String Burlap. This gorgeous background stamp is called Modern Flowers. I was so excited for this one. It's a 6x6 cling stamp. Background stamps are very fun to play with. And they're kind of like a showstopper. All you have to do is stamp this and put a sentiment on it, and I think you'd be done. This is a 6x8 clear stamp set called Mandy's Flowers, and I was so excited for that. It's just gorgeous. This luxury embossed paper is from Tonic, and it's called Powder Blue Lace. They always include an example sheet to give you some inspiration. They're always so pretty. And then last but not least, they include a piece of white cardstock and pink. It's called Cotton Candy. I also purchased the coordinating dies. They come separate from the kit, but I really love this stamp set and I know I'm going to be using it a lot, so I wanted to have the dies for it. That's another reason for my delay. I was waiting for the dies to come in. They include the dies for the big sentiments, and I really thought that would be fun to work with. In this video, I'm going to be doing lots of techniques with the coordinating dies. So let's get right into the card crafting. For my first card, I'm going to stamp the fence and this little pot of flowers. To stamp all of my images today, I'm going to use the Simon Says Stamp Intense Black ink. It's another good ink. I really like it. And I end up stamping these out a few times to get a nice crisp impression on this white cardstock. I'm going to color in these images with my Copic markers, and so this ink works for that. It won't bleed. I'm going to go through the coloring rather quickly to save some time on this extra long video this time. To create the look of wood grain on this picket fence, I'm using some earth tone markers. So I'm starting out with my E31 as my lightest color. Then I go in with E35 for my medium, and my darkest is E37. And I did speed this up a lot, just for the sake of time, as I said. I'm going over the whole fence with an YR23. This is a yellow ochre. That just warms up the tone of the wood. I really love this marker. I use this a lot with my colored pencils, too. Yellow ochre is just my favorite color, I think. I'm going to put a little bit of blue sky around this fence. And now on to my flowers. For these cards, I used my Copic marker chart a lot. It helps me to figure out which markers are going to complement each other. And you can download it for free off of the Copic Markers website. I ordered Tim Holtz's new glass mat, and I believe I ordered it back in April, and it just finally came in. And I'm trying to figure out how to prevent the glare from the lamp above my table. So I apologize if that is too obtrusive. Now I'm restamping these images just to crispen up the black lines. That looks so much better. I'm going to go ahead and use the coordinating dies for these. And then after I die cut them, I'm going to just cut out these flowers. I don't want the pot for this card. And I'm also going to put the same blue marker around these flowers and greenery. For my sentiment, I'm going to stamp that onto a piece of the pattern paper. And I just created that into a frame. And I'm using more black ink to stamp that right onto the frame. This one's so pretty. It says "with love," and it has all of these cute curly cues around it. I'm going to prop up this frame with some foam tape, just one layer. And I'm going to put this right onto a white card base. And it's just a little bit smaller than my card base. I'm using more foam tape behind the fence. And I'm going to put that right in the center of this frame. And I'm also going to use more foam tape on these flowers. So these flowers are really going to stick out from this card and look 3D-ish. I'm using lots of little pieces of foam tape so that this whole image is covered. That way it won't flatten out in the mail. And then I can just pull off the release tape, and I'm going to put that right in front of the fence. I think that looks so cute. And then I'm going to pull out my Wink of Stella pen just to add a little bit of sparkle to these two flowers. It's hard to see this glitter in the video, but I'll turn it here in just a sec and you can see it catch the light. If you can see that, it just adds a fun touch to your cards. I'm also going to stamp these flowers onto a piece of the pattern paper for the inside of my card. One of my very favorite techniques to do is to stamp images on pattern paper and then to color it in with Prismacolor pencils or whatever kind of colored pencils you have. Looks really pretty. So I stamped that up a couple of times to get a good impression. And I'm going to cut this down as well so you don't see the pot. So it looks like the flowers on the outside of the card. And I'm going to glue that right in the center of my card. And then it will just take me just a few minutes to color in the flowers with my Prismacolor pencils. It just adds a fun surprise for the recipient to open up and see the flowers again on this pretty pattern paper. Next, I'm creating a frame to go around my window. I used the same rectangle die cut that I used for my pattern paper. I'm cutting away the paper around the window just to add a narrow frame. This is just a little bit of liquid glue I'm putting behind it. This frame just finishes off the card nicely. I like the complementary colors of yellow and purple together. And that completes card number 1. I'll hold that up here so you can get a closer look at it and the inside. I'm going to ink up this background stamp for this card. I'm inking this up with some Versamark ink, and then I'm going to pour over some white embossing powder. So I stamped this out a few times, and this is a piece of Bristol smooth cardstock that I'm using because it goes really well with this technique. I'm going to be doing some ink blending with my Distress Oxide inks. Here is the white embossing powder I'm pouring over it. I'm just flicking off the excess, and then I can pour on more powder on the other side. It's kind of hard to see because it's white on white. I allowed my heat tool to heat up for about a minute before I brought it to my paper. And then once the embossing powder is melted, then I'm going to let it sit for just a minute to cool, and I can start on my ink blending. This color is Broken China. It has a very antique look to it when I start ink blending it onto this paper. It kind of reminds me of Wedgwood china, the old-fashioned china that you could get in this blue color. And I was going to use more than one color, but I liked this so well that I decided just to put this color over the whole background. I'm using a clean cloth to rub off the ink off of the embossing, and it just brightens up the whiteness of the embossed flowers. And now for a bit of coloring. I'm using some neutral grays to color in this container. And then for the actual rose itself, I'm using one of my favorite combos. I'm using R85, 83, and 81. It makes it into kind of a dusty pink rose. And then an R56, just to add a little more contrast in the shadows of this rose. For the greens, I'm using YG06 and YG09. There is a little bit of a contrast between these two colors, but I just liked the look of that. I was going to keep this background whole, but I decided I wanted to cut it up into strips. I'm cutting up some of the cotton candy cardstock that came in this kit into strips too. And I'm just going to layer it onto this piece of white cardstock. I'm using some of my Gina K Connect glue to adhere these down. And I'm just using a piece of type paper behind it just to catch the wet glue. Now I can cut off the excess. And I'm going to adhere this panel onto a piece of the cotton candy cardstock that I made into the card base. And I'm just kind of holding that down until it adheres well. I'm using some foam squares so I can add a little bit of dimension to this vase and rose. Once I pull off the release paper, I'm going to put this in the corner of my card. I also stamped out the sentiment with some black ink, and I used the coordinating die with that. And I'm going to pop this up with some more foam squares. And it's so cute. It says, "For you." I'm going to add more Wink of Stella for this card. I think I used Wink of Stella a lot for this card video. I do love a little touch of glitter on my cards. For the inside of my card, I wanted to use up some of the pretty scraps that I had left over. So I'm going to use a little bit in the corner. Along this corner, I stamped the sentiment "From my heart to yours." And this is where I remembered I forgot my pink stripes of paper. And this really adds a lot to the presentation of this card. I'm just going to add them above my blue pattern stripes. And then I'm going to very carefully cut off the excess of those, and my card is complete. And here's another look at the inside. And again, I just love that background stamp. It's so gorgeous. On to card number 3. And I really love wreath cards, and so this one was just right up my alley. I'm die cutting the wreath out of a piece of the pretty pattern paper, and I'm going to have the stamp recessed onto this pink cardstock. I'm just trying to get an idea of where I want that to be, and I'm going to remove this pattern paper just so I don't get any ink on it. I made sure to keep the corner piece of pattern paper that came off when I die cut it, because I'm going to be piecing that back together. I'm going to ink this up a few times so it's nice and crisp. And then I'm going to pull out some Prismacolor pencils. I love using Prismacolor pencils on colored papers. It just gives you a nice base color to start with. I'll have the colors listed over on my blog. To pick out the colors, I used my Prismacolor chart and lined it up to the pattern paper to see which colors matched the best. It didn't take much time at all to color in this pretty flowers and the leaves. I find that colored cardstocks have more texture, and so they're really fun to color on because it just grabs the pigment off of your pencils. For my sentiment, I'm using the one that just says thank you. At first, I wanted the flower so it would be on the left side of the wreath, but I discovered that the thank you sentiment didn't fit that way. It would have overlapped the flower. So I had to put the flower at the bottom, and then this stamp fit in just perfectly. Now I can pull this out of my mini MISTI and adhere the pattern paper over top. You could even pop up this pattern paper with some foam tape, but I just wanted to adhere mine flat onto my card base. I didn't want to forget to adhere the little corner piece because it does balance the card out a lot better than if I had left it off. I'm trying to align that so it matches up with the sides and the bottom. Sorry, my head gets in the way here, but I just had to look over this. And now I can adhere this panel onto my card base. I'm just using a piece of white cardstock for that. On the inside, I stamped "For Your Kindness" with one of the hearts and one of the little flower stamps. And I'm going to use up some of the leftover strips of paper for the bottom of my card. Very simple, but I like just a little touch of something on the insides of my cards. And then I can just cut off the excess. So the sentiment reads, "Thank you" on the outside, and on the inside it says, "For your kindness." I really like how this one turned out. On to card number 4. I'm turning this into a chalkboard card, so I'm stamping out my image with some unicorn white ink onto a piece of black cardstock. And it doesn't have to be perfectly stamped because I'm going to use my Prismacolor pencils to color in these tulips. And then after I'm done with my coloring, I'm going to stamp it again with some Versamark ink and pour over some white embossing powder, and that will make my lines really stand out. The reason I just used white pigment ink to begin with is because it's easier to color when you don't have the embossed lines getting in the way. And then I tend to color over my embossed lines and they don't pop as well once you color over them with your colored pencils. I'm using some embossing powder so I don't get strays of white embossing powder on my black cardstock. And I cleaned off my stamp really well, and now I'm just inking it up with some Versamark ink. And I'm going to do this twice just to make sure it's nice and sticky and catches onto the embossing powder. Now you'll see the white lines just pop. It looks so pretty. I let my heat tool heat up again for a minute. This prevents your cardstock from warping. Once the image has cooled off, I just use a clean cloth to wipe off the excess of anti-static powder. I cut out this image with a rectangular die and added some foam tape behind it. I'm just going to put this in the lower right corner of my card. I'm also using some of the pretty cardstock that came in this kit, and I cut that down to 5¼ by 4 so that you could see the white edges of my card base peeking through. And then for the sentiment, it just simply says "Picked with Love." And I'm adding a few of the cute enamel hearts around my sentiment. And now for the inside of the card, this is going to be really simple. Just another strip of the leftover pattern paper. And then I'm going to stamp the sentiment that says, "For you." And I didn't put this in my MISTI, so I'm holding down my stamp just to let the ink soak in a little bit. And then I stamped one more additional heart on the inside, and there is my completed card. I really love the look of these chalkboard cards. On my next card, I already colored in my image with some Copic markers. I cut out a mask using the coordinating die, and you can see through this paper really well, so I'm just trying to center it perfectly over this flower image. I'm going to be stamping a lot of the smaller sentiments around this image. This was kind of tricky to do because these sentiments are so small. I kept accidentally bumping into them with my fingers and misaligning them. But here I am pulling all of them out. And I just want to stamp them down the whole panel of this card. I didn't include all of the fumbling and bungling I did on this card just because it took so long. I don't want to put you through that. So I'm stamping out the sentiments here onto a piece of scrap acetate just to make sure they align and just to get an idea of how it's going to look down the center of this panel. And then I can ink up these sentiments and stamp it onto my panel. And I'm using some black ink to do that. The mask will protect my flowers, so it looked like the sentiments are going behind the flowers. And then I'm going to shift this panel and stamp it out one more time so it covers the bottom of this panel as well. And I do ink this up a couple of times just to get it good and crisp. And after all of this work, I do think it was worth it because I really love how this turned out. I love the look of text on cards, whole blocks of them. And here I am pulling off the mask, and there are a few dots of ink that I didn't like. The sentiment didn't stamp out well there, so I'm just hiding them with a stamp that came in the set that have 3 little dots. And I think that adds cute airiness to the card. So I did stamp out and color in this image twice. I want it to look 3D. So I'm going to cut out the top of this pot and the saucer around the bottom, or the holder, whatever you call that catches the water. I'm also going to cut out the 2 flowers. You're probably wondering why I colored in the image on my card panel if I'm going to be hiding it anyway behind these flowers and the parts of the pot. But I didn't want it to show through the sides and show white. And it was also just good practice coloring with my Copic markers. I'm cutting that out to the very edge very carefully. I don't want to cut away any of the black lines. I'm adding the foam squares now behind these teeny tiny little images and place them right over the top of these stamped images. I do have to cut down some of these foam squares just because they don't fit. I had to cut down these foam squares into very narrow pieces to fit behind the parts of this pot. But all of this extra work is worth it. I really love how this card turns out. And I pull out my Wink of Stella just to color in the 2 flowers again. And now I can adhere my card together. I'm going to add this main panel onto a piece of sweet corn cardstock from Gina K. I cut out a piece of the pattern paper with a frame die and put that around my white panel. And then for an added sentiment, I cut out the sentiment that says "with love," and I stamped that with some pink dye ink. And I'm going to adhere this above my flowers. I think it turns out really cute. I love all of this text that you see on this card. I'm going to turn this card so that you can see the cute dimension. Looks like parts of this vase are popped forward. On the inside of the card, I added a couple of strips of paper from this pattern paper. Just very simply designed on the inside. On my next card, I did all of my Copic coloring off screen again, just for the sake of time. And I'm going to use my very favorite piece of pattern paper from this kit. I think they should have added a couple of pieces of this just because it's so pretty and elegant looking. So I colored in this jar of flowers, of tulips. I used some more Copic markers, and I will have them listed, as I said before, on my blog. And I'm using another small piece of the tickled pink cardstock, and I taped that down kind of askew. The scripty paper is going to be straight. And then I'm using some foam tape behind this jar of flowers to pop them up off of the card. I also have a scalloped frame that I'm going to be gluing on, and this just adds a cute touch of elegance. I'm using just a little bit of Gina K Connect glue because I don't want it oozing out from the sides. This rectangle die cuts off the scallop, so you can use them as two pieces if you want. It's very versatile, but sometime in the future I'd like to get a rectangular scallop die that's just all one piece. I think that would be nice. I'm stamping out some hearts and some little dots with some more distress oxides. I just wanted to carry the colors over onto this block of text pattern paper. I also pulled out my little bottle of Nouveau drops, and this is bubblegum blush again, and I'm just putting some little dots here and there. So I put this card up on one of my shelves just so I wouldn't sit something on top of it and smush my Nouveau drops, and I allowed it to dry overnight. On card number 7, I'm stamping my images onto a piece of craft cardstock. I'm stamping my images right in the center of this card panel. I'm going to use the coordinating dies for both of these stamps to do some partial die cutting. But before I do that, I color in my flower with some Prismacolor pencils. And I did that off camera just to save time. Once I color it, it does dull the lines, so here I am restamping that. I always like to do that if I can remember to keep my images on the door of my Misty. I'm drawing in a straight line down the center of this panel. Everything to the right of this line I'm going to die cut. I put my Sizzix Big Shot machine on my desk just so I could show you how I do this. So I have some smaller plates that I like to use when I do partial die cutting. I put my panel in between these plates. Everything between the plates will be die cut. I'm going to carefully remove the purple tape so that I don't rip my card panel. And then you'll see that half of my sentiment and half of my flower vase have been cut out. I'm going to use the wire guide on my paper trimmer to see where I need to cut out the rest of the panel. And I'm just moving very slowly so that I don't cut into my flower image or my sentiment. The wire guide on this paper trimmer really comes in handy because it shows you exactly where it's going to cut. Most of this has been cut out, but there's a little bit that's hanging onto the flower. So I'm going to pull out my penknife and just carefully cut around this flower. And then you'll be able to see how cute this looks with half of it cut out and half of it attached to the craft cardstock. I'm going to adhere my flower panel onto another piece of pattern paper. I chose this very subtle piece of blue paper, and I am going to use a strip of the tonic powder blue paper on the edge of this. I tried to color in my vase for this flower to match the color of this powder blue paper. And I think it just adds a cute touch of brightness along the edge of this. I'm cutting this panel down to 5¼ by 4. I like the white of my card base to show at the edges. Popping up my die cut panel with some foam tape. And then I could go ahead and attach it to my pattern paper. And I think that looks really cute popped up like that. I'm using some tape runner to attach this onto my white card base. On the inside of my card, I'm going to use that leftover scrap of pattern paper, and then I'm going to stamp my sentiment right above it. This will say, "For your kindness." I'm going to add a few heart sprinkles onto this card panel. I had them kind of diagonal, and I end up changing them so they're sitting more straight. But I'm going to put a little blue one in the center of this card, and they're thin enough to do that. I'm adding more Wink of Stella onto my flowers, and that finishes off this card. Here's a close-up look of this card and the inside. If you've never tried this technique, you should really give it a try. It's so much fun. I'm going to create my own pattern paper for card number 8. I'm using the really small stamps from this set. This is the little leaf image, and I'm making sure to turn my panel so they're not all facing the same way. Next, I'm using the dots and then the hearts, and I'm just stamping this up with black ink. I really love how this pattern turns out. I did go ahead and die cut this panel with a rectangular die, and I'm going to use the wreath image again. I colored that in with some Prismacolor pencils, and I'm stamping the sentiment, "Thank you for everything," on the inside with a couple of hearts. I used the coordinating die for this wreath to cut it out, so it'd be all ready to go. To blend on some ink with some Distress Oxides. And I'm using cracked pistachio and iced spruce. I really like this ice spruced color. It's more gray than green, but it makes it look really old-fashioned and cute. And then I'm putting some cracked pistachio over it. And this turns out to be one of my favorite cards. If I could do this card over, I would have done the ink blending first and then stamped my little images over it, because they do get a little bit obscured behind the ink. And I'm going to use the twine that came in this set to wrap around this card panel. I propped up my wreath with some foam tape. And now I'm going to tie a little bow on the side. I have a big spool of this twine, and I do use it a lot. It's thin enough to go through the mail really well. Once I have that situated, I can cut off the ends of this bow. I'm using some Gina K Connect glue to attach this panel onto a black card base. I really like the look of the black card base behind this panel. And then to decorate the inside, I'm going to do some heat embossing with some white embossing powder. So I'm using my anti-static powder first, and then my Versamark ink to stamp up my images and my sentiment. And I'm using the cute little line underneath my sentiment that came in the set. And now I can pour on the white embossing powder. To write your sentiment on this card, you will have to use a white gel pen, but I think that just makes it even more fun for the recipient to see. And here's my completed card. And here's a peek at the inside. I'm using the background stamp again for card number 9, and I'm stamping that onto another piece of Bristol Smooth cardstock. This embossing powder has silver glitter in it, so it turns out really bright and pretty. I don't want to get my fingers in the glitter, so I'm just using a piece of tape to hold on to this panel. And there was a little patch in the middle that I didn't ink up as well, but I'm going to carry on and just keep using this panel. And I will be able to hide that empty spot with one of my images. Again, I let my heat tool warm up for a good minute before I bring it to the panel. And once this embossing powder starts to melt, you can really see the glitter in it. It's so beautiful. I'm going to use one of my favorite Distress Oxide colors to add some color to this panel, and this is the Tattered Rose. Once I finish blending on all of the color, I'm going to use a clean cloth just to wipe off the embossing powder from the embossed flowers. This just brightens them up a little bit more. I'm going to use one of the coordinating dies over that empty spot to fix that problem. And I'm going to have my image of this flower and vase recessed underneath this panel. This embossed panel with this silver glitter in it is the star of this card, so I'm going to allow a lot of it to show. Next, I'm going to stamp out my vase and roses, and then color them in with some more Copic markers, using really bright colors so that it stands out from underneath this panel. Once I'm finished with my coloring, I'm going to add some foam tape behind my embossed panel to pop that up a little bit. I'm going to die cut my sentiment that says "With Love," and I stamped that out with some bright pink ink. I'm going to use some more foam tape behind this. This is a very dimensional card. My flower and vase are recessed behind this panel, and then my sentiment is going to be propped up a little bit. This was a really fun card to put together, and I really love how it turned out. I'm going to put the sentiment just at the bottom of the card. I want a lot of this beautiful embossed paper to show. I'm going to do some more heat embossing on the inside of this card. I'm going to stamp out the vase and another sentiment. Some bright pink embossing powder. I've had this in my stash for a long time, and I'm going to use it on the inside of this card. And I'm not going to color it in. It's just going to be the outlines of this flower. I can attach my panel onto my card base. And this card is complete. For my very last card, I'm going to emboss this piece of cardstock just with my Fiskars paper trimmer and my bone folder. And I'm just going to create some lines down this card. And I'm putting a line at every half-inch mark. I've never tried this technique before, but I've seen other card crafters use it, and I've always liked the results. So I wanted to give this a try. It looks so cute. I'm just going to cut this panel down a little bit. I'm going to use the pattern paper that has the cute vases and flowers on it. And I'm going to center that onto a piece of the tonic powdered blue paper. And then for my white embossed panel, I'm going to set that down in the corner. Already colored in my stamped image, and I popped that up with some more foam tape, and I'm going to put that down in the corner. The sentiment I chose to put together says, "With love for your kindness." I really like the typewriter looking fonts from this stamp set. I think it looks really cute. And of course, a little bit more Wink of Stella on the flowers. And just one single heart at the end of this first sentiment. For the inside, I'm just going to use another strip of the powder blue tonic paper and my pattern paper. I'm just going to glue them along the edge. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you were inspired to sit down and create something awesome. I hope you all have a wonderful week. Bye.